who are unable to join last week, we did an introduction to financial management. We started off with an introduction to treasury. We discussed the main officers in a treasury. Right? The treasury is divided into 3 units. If you all can recall what we did last week, the treasury is segregated into 3 units. That's for segregation of duties. So there's a front office, middle office, and a back office. Right? The front office executes transactions. Then the middle office monitors the risk, and back office does all the accounting and record keeping. Right, so there are 3 different lines of reporting. Front office usually reports to CEO, middle office to the CRO, and back office to the CFO. 3 different lines. So then we discussed some rogue traders, right? Traders who have exceeded their authority and made lots of losses to the banks. So there was Nick Leeson from Barings Bank. Now, because of Nick Leeson, Barings Bank had to close down. Remember, it was a 225-year-old bank, but it had to close down because of what Nick Leeson did. And then there was Kweku Adeboli from UBS, Jerome Kerbel from Societe Generale, and Bruno Exil from JP Morgan. And so these guys were called rogue traders because they exceeded their authority. They were not supposed to do what they were doing. They were not supposed to take that sort of risks, but that's what they did because of poor monitoring and all that. So eventually banks ended up losing a lot of money. And in the case of Barings, they had to close business completely. Right, and then we discussed the various desks in a front office. There was the money market desk, the fixed income desk, corporate desk, foreign exchange desk, interbank, derivatives, equity. Right. Okay, so that was from week 1. Now, any questions that you all may have from last week? Okay, so I'm assuming no questions. We can move on. Yeah, feel free to ask questions. Right. So I presume all of you would have received the notes for this week. Yeah. Right. So we'll start off with equity. Okay, so let's do an introduction to equity now. Equity is nothing new. We all of you have done equity. So some of you might be dealing or trading in the stock market also. So what are equities? What is the difference between equity and fixed income? And there are 2 types of markets. Now, one is an equity market. The other one is fixed income market. So what is the difference between fixed income and equity? Yeah. And also, what is the difference between money markets and capital markets? Just 1 minute until I get this page sorted out. Right. Okay, that's fine. What is the difference between money markets and capital markets? I hope you all can see the screen. Yeah, Shan, last week's lecture notes I thought were uploaded. think that it would have been shared last week. Right. It's anyway with the office, so they will send it across to you all if they haven't done it so far. Right, so difference between money markets and capital markets. Now, if you want to raise funds short term, if an institution wants to raise funds short term, now, for example, let's take John Keells, right? Let's say they have a short term requirement, a short term, maybe a working capital requirement. What type of instrument will they issue to raise debt? Will they issue equity, or will they go for a short term instrument like maybe a debenture or a bank loan? Something like that. What do you all think? Yeah, a short term, they will usually go for a short term instrument, right? Maybe a bank loan, an overdraft, or a debenture. Whereas long term, now if they want to expand, for example, if they are planning expansion within the group, a 20-year project, they are getting into maybe a new area, a new sector. John Keells is present in all sectors except, if I'm not mistaken, one or two. Right? They're not. Their presence is not there in garments. They're not in garments and something else. Right? Just a very few sectors. A fully diversified group. A fantastic business model. Now, if they are getting into, let's say, garments, right? A long-term project. It's not short-term, not short-term borrowing, long-term borrowing. What will they do? How will they fund it? Usually, they will issue equity, right? But if it's a short-term thing, now, if they are hotels, want working capital finance, they will then go for a bank loan, right? Or maybe they might issue a debenture. Okay. So based on the tenor that they require the funds, they will structure different instruments. If it's short term or medium term, they will go for debt instruments. Or long term, they will go for equity instruments. Right? So that's the difference between capital markets and money markets. So capital markets are long term. Your long term borrowing needs are catered from the capital markets. Money markets usually cater to short term needs, like your overdrafts and all that. Usually debentures, overdrafts, call money, and repos are money market instruments. Right? Capital market instruments are long term, like equity. Right? Voting shares, non-voting shares, and all that. So those come under capital markets. Right? Now, what does a financial market do? It transfers funds from the surplus unit to a deficit unit, right? Through an intermediary. Right? The intermediary is the financial market. Okay, so you have savers who will invest in markets, right? In the share market or the bond market. So the share market is the equity market or fixed income market. And through that, they will invest in companies in the form of shares or debt or equity, in other words. Right? So equity will be pumped into companies, and fixed income or debt instruments will be funded also into companies or governments. Right? Now, through banks, depositors give funds to banks, and banks on the other side, they will lend it to deficit units. Right? So there can be share issues or bond issues. So money market refers to markets for securities with maturities of 1 year or less. Less than 1 year, anything less than 1 year is money market, right? The short-term instruments like commercial paper is money market instruments. Now, if you look at it, corporates as well as the government can raise debt instruments. Yeah, when a corporate raises debt instrument, it is called corporate debt. When a government raises funds, it's called a treasury bill or a treasury bond. A corporate debt, if it's less than 1 year, it will be termed as commercial paper. Commercial paper is instrument which has a maturity of less than 1 year. More than 1 year are debentures, right? So that's the difference between corporate debt and government debt. Government debt less than 1 year is called treasury bills. More than 1 year, treasury bonds. Right? That is at the time of issuance. Capital markets refer to markets for long-term debt instruments and equity securities that have no specific maturity date. Right? So debentures as well as equity are capital markets. Short-term markets are money markets. Right? So it depends on what is your time horizon For what horizon are you going to borrow? Then there are markets called primary markets and secondary markets. Now, what are primary and what are secondary? It's like the closest analogy I can quote is primary market is like getting married for the first time. When you get married for the first time, it's like the primary market. Subsequently, when you get married the second time, third time, and so on. That means you're trading in the secondary market, right? So likewise, when a security is issued for the first time, it's issued in the primary market. For example, a treasury bill or a treasury bond can be issued directly by the central bank to the market through a primary market. And subsequently, once it is in the primary market, participants will start trading in the secondary market. Okay, so that's how an instrument goes from primary market to a secondary market. Okay, already issued instruments will be traded in the secondary market only. Yeah. A primary market is one in which a borrower obtains funds from a lender by selling newly issued securities, right? So newly issued securities will always come in the primary market. When a share is issued for the first time, it is issued in an initial public offer. That's the primary market. Treasury bills and bonds are issued at auctions. Buying shares of JKH stock from an IPO is an example. Sri Lanka hasn't seen an IPO for some time, but we had a plethora of IPOs some time back. Right? Now this was post-war, about 2010-11. We had a whole series of IPOs coming into the market. Secondary financial markets are those where people can buy and sell existing securities. So that's the most important point. In the secondary market, you have existing securities, nothing new. Buying a share of John Keells stock is not purchased directly from the company, but from an investor in the secondary market. So if you are investing in John Keells, right, you are buying into shares which has already been issued. You are not trading in the primary market. That is called the secondary market. Financial assets include securities, stocks and bonds, derivative contracts, and currencies. Real estate assets include real estate, equipment, commodities, and other physical assets. So you can invest either in financial assets or in real assets. Right? Financial assets are, as all of us know, they are the typical assets in which we invest, like stocks, bonds, FDs, and all that. Debentures. Real assets are assets which you can touch and feel. Yeah, it's like land and buildings, real estate, property, commodities, vehicles. These are real assets. Sorry, there are some questions. Presentation screen is quite small. I'm not too sure how to make it big. Right. Do debentures, are debentures short term, Lakshmi? That is your question. Well, debentures are usually corporate debt which are issued for a period, which is more than 1 year, right? So usually they are issued for more than 1 year, but usually less than 10 years. Maximum of corporate debt in Sri Lanka will go up to is about 10 years. Now of late we haven't seen 10-year instruments. Last year there was, I think, 7-year and 5-year debentures issued. But remember, at the time of issuance, it's more than 1 year, and it can extend up to about 10 to 15 years, right? So debentures are not short term when they are initially issued. But only thing, now there are debentures which might mature in 3 months. And debentures which mature, let's say, in August. Now these debentures were originally issued about 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. Right? So from the time of issuance, the debenture will extend for a period of more than 1 year. So it's not a short-term instrument; they are long-term. right? So I hope I answered your question. Right, so methods of financing, we can have direct financing as well as indirect financing. Now, direct financing is where the borrower and the lender meet and negotiate with each other, right? So, for example, well, if you're a corporate that is looking to raise funds, you can go to an investor whom you know will have funds, right? Maybe a high net worth individual, or you can go to an insurance company or a bank and ask them for funding directly. That's called direct financing. Indirect finance is where you deal through a third party, right? That's indirect finance. So you go to a bank, that is indirect finance. So this is how funds flow through the system, right? In direct finance and indirect finance, you transfer funds from surplus units or the savers to borrowers, right? So they will give funds to the financial markets, and these funds will be utilized by the borrowers. Okay, so surplus units will be investing in the deficit unit. Financial markets are places where financial instruments are bought and sold. Right? These markets enable both firms and individuals to find financing for their activity. Now, institutions as well as individuals will need money. That's why individuals take housing loans, personal loans, and all that. Right? That is for their borrowing needs. That's for individuals. Organizations will need for expansion, working capital, and all that. These markets promote economic efficiency, right? So market has to be efficient. Now, what do you mean by an efficient market? An efficient market is a market where there is lots of liquidity. So you're not short of liquidity. Whenever you want funds, you can go and, if you're a borrower, if you want funds, you can go and borrow any amount. Then if you're a lender, you should be able to enter into an investment as well as exit without loss of value. If you're making a loss when you enter or exit, then that market doesn't have, it lacks liquidity. Right? So it's very important that the market has liquidity. Now, if you take the Sri Lankan stock market, it is a very small market now. Compared to other markets like the US, our stock market is very small, right? It's like a rounding off error. Now, that is why most of the foreigners are reluctant to enter this market, because they enter the market and they want to buy big chunks, there is no liquidity. And if they start buying the big amounts, maybe the price might start going up. And if they want to exit, they will have to sell the shares. Now, that is also a problem in Sri Lankan markets, because exiting, if they start selling in bulk, then the price will start coming down. Right? So enter and exit, you can't do without incurring lots of costs or losses. If that is the case, the market is illiquid, like the Sri Lankan stock market, which is not liquid at all, compared to what foreigners might expect. Right? When you and I want to trade, we have small amounts, so we have ample liquidity for that. But for foreigners, it is not the case. Right? So market should be deep. A deep market has lots of liquidity. That means you do a big transaction, it doesn't move markets. Now, take John Keells, for example. Last week, John Keells was trading huge volumes of John Keells. Right? Blocks of John Keells were trading, but the price hardly moved. It was trading with a range of 1 to 2 rupees, hardly anything. So that's a liquid market. That's pretty good. That's how market should be. It should go it has to go on demand and supply, but also it has to have lots of liquidity, so that you have confidence that you can enter as well as exit. Right? Otherwise, it can't be like marriage. No? You enter, there is no exit, then big problem. No. Okay, so markets have to be liquid. Yeah. Also, the transaction cost should be very low in an efficient market. Transaction cost will include buying and selling spreads, right? Meaning bid and offer. If the bid offer spread is very wide, then it's not going to help market participants. You're going to have a huge loss when you want to buy and exit very frequently. Now, for example, let's say the bid offer spread of a share is 10 rupees, right? Against the bid offer spread of another share is 1 rupee. So if the bid offer spread is low, then it's good. If you want to exit, the maximum loss you will make is 1 rupee. But if it's 10 rupees, then you're going to lose more. Okay, so bid offer spread is very important. Then taxes. Now, if government levies huge taxes when you want to buy shares, for example, the transaction cost is going to be very high. Commissions, broker commissions. In Sri Lanka, these transaction costs are about 1.2%, which is pretty high, right? Very high cost. So ideally, transaction cost has to be very low so that it encourages turnover to increase. So markets ensure resources are available to those who put them into their best use, and they keep transaction cost low, which is an important thing. Okay, so we discussed the screen, money markets and capital markets. Money markets, remember, short-term instruments, usually less than 1 year. Capital markets are longer term. Medium to long term are under capital markets. Right, so money markets refer to markets for securities with maturities of 1 year or less. Capital markets refer to markets for long-term debt securities and equity securities that have no specific maturity date. Right, so primary market, secondary markets we discussed. Primary market is one in which a borrower obtains funds from a lender by selling newly issued securities. So remember, newly issued securities are always available in the primary market. Buying shares of John Keells from an IPO. Secondary market is one in which people can buy and sell existing securities. Buying a share of John Keells is not purchased directly from the company, but from another investor in the secondary market. So remember, if you are dealing in the secondary market, you're not dealing with the company, right? The company does not get even a cent out of your shares, out of the money that you invest. The company will only get funds in the primary market or in the IPO. So remember, a company will get money only in the primary market, right? So in the case of a corporate, if they raise shares, they will receive funds only in an IPO. If, for example, John Keells had issued shares in an IPO, they will get funds directly from the market in the IPO. But if John Keells' share is subsequently traded in the market, John Keells will not get a cent. So that's how primary markets work. Now, in the case of a treasury bill auction or treasury bond auction, the government will raise funds only in the primary market. They will not raise funds in the secondary market. Yeah. Financial assets versus real assets. We discussed financial assets are assets which are usually intangible, something like shares, then debentures, commercial paper. Right, all these are financial assets. Even bonds and bills, treasury bonds, treasury bills, these are also financial assets. Real assets are physical assets which we can use, like land and buildings, plant and machinery, equipment, vehicles. Right. So what is a share? Shares are issued by corporates. They are long-term borrowing instruments or long-term instruments. So they come under capital markets. Now, what is the difference between a share and fixed income instrument? Equity and fixed income, basically. Yeah, if you own shares, you own the company. But if you own debentures or debt instruments, you don't own the company. That is one difference. So there is ownership, right, when it comes to equity. But fixed income, there is no ownership. Also, the other difference is now risk. In terms of risk, if you are invested in shares, right? If the company, let me come back. It's like take the country for example. Now, Sri Lanka is fighting, or we are clamoring to get foreign direct investments, FDIs. So why are we so desperately wanting foreign direct investments? Because we are getting lots of debt. Debt has never been an issue. regardless of the amount of debt we need, we have been getting it. Right? So the flow of debt has always been very, very steady. What has been lacking is equity investments. Now, why is that the case? Because if you invest in debt, right? If take for example the government, if the government, let's say, is funding a highway, and if the highway by any chance is a failure, no one is using the highway, and if it was funded through debt, right? Then regardless of the success of the highway, the government will still have to pay interest, right? So if it was funded with a dollar loan, regardless of there being revenues from the highway or not, the government will always have to keep funding the interest. But that is in the case of debt. But if it was equity funded, then the government has no obligation to keep paying interest. There is no such obligation. And the government doesn't have to pay dividends, right? There is no obligation. So if the project is a failure and it was debt funded, then the onus of the project is on the borrower, right? Whether it's a success or a failure, the borrower will have to keep servicing debt. But if it's equity funded, then the risk of the investment is transferred from the borrower to the investor, right? So rather than the borrower taking the risk of the project, the investor is now taking the risk, because it's in terms of risk transfer. So if in the case of equity, investors take the risk, not the borrower, right? So that's how this market works. Shares or securities represent ownership of a company, right? That's in the case of ordinary shares. Now, ordinary shares also, you have voting as well as non-voting. So if you invest in voting shares, then you have ownership. Otherwise, you don't have ownership. If you are invested in non-voting, that the difference between voting and non-voting is, in voting, as the name implies, you can make decisions, but non-voting, you cannot make decisions. A share represents a claim on the company's assets and earnings. Now, that is a residual claim. That if you have invested in equity, compared to investing in a debenture, the difference is if the company is liquidated at some point, right? The company will then pay the senior debt first. Okay, those that have been secured by or collateralized by assets will be settled first. Those that are senior, the senior debt will be settled first, and then they get to the debentures, the subordinated debt. And if there is anything that remains after that, only they get into equity. So the equity holders are taking the highest risk, right? When it comes to a liquidation. So if equity, if I may ask you this question, which one is going to cost you more, cost a company more, debt or equity? What is the costlier version of funding? Is it debt or is it equity? The answer is, now there is, if you take a high risk, your returns will have to be high or low. You will have to have high returns. No, high risk coupled with low returns does not make sense. So if you are taking high risk, your return also has to be correspondingly high. So high risk, high return. Okay, so likewise, now remember what we mentioned earlier. Equity investors are taking a higher risk than debt investors when it comes to liquidation. So to compensate for the higher risk, they will have to have a higher return, right? So equity should have higher return than debt. So remember, equity will cost you more than debt. So a share represents a claim on the company's assets and earnings. Right? Remember, a share represents a residual claim on the company's assets and earnings. Residual claim. As you acquire more shares, your ownership stake in the company becomes greater. Right? So if you are invested, let's say, in 1% of a company, and if you're invested in 10% of a company, your ownership is larger when you have a higher percentage of shares, obviously. No? So whether you say shares, securities, equity, or shares, it all means the same thing. Holding a company's shares means that you are one of the many shareholders of the company. A share represented by a share certificate, which is not there anymore. Right? You don't have share certificates anymore because it's all CDS based. It's all online. this fancy piece of paper that is proof of your ownership. Today, these records are kept electronically. Being a shareholder of a company does not mean you have a say in day-to-day running of the operation. So if you buy John Keel's share, for example, you have one share, you can't run into John Keel's and tell them that they are doing this wrong. Okay, they should get out of the hotel business, for example. You can't say that. You're not allowed to say it. Even if you have 10% of the shares, if you have 50%, you can't still do it. You can only voice your concerns at AGMs. Right? Maybe you can write to the company secretary and all that, but you can't get involved in day-to-day operation. You can't micromanage. Instead, you get one vote per share to elect the board at annual general meetings. Right? So you can cast your vote to elect directors to represent the company. A board of directors runs the company operations on behalf of shareholders. So it's the board that runs companies, right? Not shareholders. Board makes decisions on behalf of shareholders. Right? Now remember the second point, you get one vote per share to elect board at annual general meetings. So each ordinary voting shareholder has one voting right. Now at AGMs, there are two ways of voting. One is raise of hands, right? Or a poll. Now raise of hands means if a AGM is attended by 100 members or shareholders, if you're going for raise of hands at AGM, each shareholder gets an equal weightage, right? So if you have 1% of the share and if you have 50% of the share and the vote is based on raise of hands, each shareholder gets the same weightage, regardless of your ownership. But if you go for a poll, then if let's say A has 1% of shares, B has 50% of shares, the vote that A casts will have only 1% weightage, B's vote will carry 50% weight. And so that's how we vote in AGMs, raise of hands and poll. The importance of being a shareholder is that you are entitled to a portion of the company's profits and have a claim on the assets. Right? So whatever that is left as the bottom line of a company is yours if you're a shareholder. But you can't take it out. You can only take it out if dividends are declared. So out of earnings, the company will declare dividends. And so that's why you have earnings per share and dividends per share. The difference is the retention rate. So if, for example, a company earns 100 and dividends of 20 are declared, earnings per share will be 100 and dividends per share is 20. 80 is the retention rate, right? They retain 80%. That's how it works. Profits are sometimes paid out in the form of dividends. Your claim on assets is only relevant if a company goes bankrupt. Right? If a company goes bankrupt, only your claim to a company's assets will be relevant. In the case of liquidation, you'll receive what's left after all the creditors have been paid. So if a company is liquidated, you will receive only what the residual amount. By becoming an owner, you assume the risk of the company not being successful. Right? So remember, when you invest in shares, you are taking the risk of the company. Right? Investments of the company are borne by the shareholder, equity holder, not by debt holders. Another extremely important feature of shares is the limited liability. Okay, so if you have invested in John Keel's, your liability is only the amount of investment. So maximum you will lose is the investment, not beyond that. You are not personally liable if you're a shareholder. But directors can be personally liable if they're negligent. Yeah. As an owner of a share, you are not personally liable if the company is not able to pay its debt. Now, if you have invested in John Keel's and John Keel's defaults on their debt, you cannot be sued. Shareholders will not be sued. Right? Directors will be sued, but not the shareholder. Even if a company of which you are a shareholder goes bankrupt, you can never lose your personal assets. Okay, so that's very clear. Share capital is the amount raised by issuing shares. So it's the share value into the number of shares. When a company is formed, the legal documents state the authorized share capital of the company. Yeah. So authorized shares are the total amount of ordinary shares that may be issued. Authorized share capital is how much of capital in total a company can issue. Right? The total amount of capital that can be issued is called authorized capital. So there is another one called issued share capital which is the amount out of authorized, how much have been issued to the public, is called issued share capital. When a company is formed, the legal documents state the authorized share capital of a company. Issued shares are the shares that have actually been issued. So out of authorized, how much has the company actually issued? It's called issued capital. Nominal value of a share means the value of capital given for a share. So you have a nominal value or the face value of a share. And so usually companies in an IPO will mention that the value of a share is 10 rupees. They are issuing 10 rupee shares, or they are issuing 1 rupee shares, so 100 rupee shares. That's called the nominal value of a share. Issues of shares by a company may be at nominal value or at a higher price, maybe even at a discount. Right? It doesn't have to be at a higher price always. Now, if a price is higher than the nominal value, it's trading at a premium, or if it's lower than the nominal, it's trading at a discount. And so there are so many shares which have been issued at a certain price and either have gained in value or lost in value. If they are issued at a higher price, the difference between this and the nominal value is known as a share premium. So likewise, if they have been issued at a low, if they are going at a low price, it's trading at a discount. Yes, Johan, front office reports to CEO. This is from last week's notes. Middle office CRO, back office usually CFO. Okay, Lakmini's question is, explain how FDIs work, foreign direct investments. Okay, foreign direct investments are investments made by foreigners in equity of local companies. Right? So foreign investors may be individuals or high net worth individuals, or even corporates, maybe even funds coming and investing in equity, right? Or they are pumping equity into a company. That's called FDI. Whereas if it comes in the form of a loan, like for example, the sovereign debt, that's called debt. So if it's not debt, if it comes in the form of an equity infusion, it's foreign direct investments. So what they do is they will bring, let's say $1 billion and convert it at 180 or whatever and invest 180 billion in a company. Right? So they have invested or infused 180 billion rupees into a company, but it's coming in the form of, it's coming in dollars, which will get converted into rupees and then invested. Now, if you're a foreigner and if you have brought in $1 billion to be invested in Sri Lankan equity, and there are so many risks. No? One is you are converting dollars into rupees, right? So you have dollars which will be converted into rupees and invested in an asset. Now you will benefit if what happens? What do you think? You will benefit if the dollar goes to 200. If you are converting at 180, you will benefit if the dollar goes to 200 or if it goes to 150. Well, your asset is in rupees, so you will benefit if the rupee appreciates, right? Meaning if it goes to 150, you will benefit. But if it goes the other way, if it goes to 200, then you get hammered. Yeah. That's what happened recently to most of the funds that came into the country, bringing FDIs. They invested in all the top corporates like John Keells, some of the big banks. Now, these guys would have invested in John Keells at around 150 to 200 rupees. Now the share value is 110. And so there is a drop in share price. And at the time they came, the exchange rate would have been about 130, 140 levels. Now it is 180. And so they get hammered two ways. One is the drop in value of shares, plus the depreciation or the devaluation of the exchange rate. Okay, so if you're a foreign investor, there are two things you need to consider: the exchange rate as well as the share price appreciation. Two things. Also, there are so many other things that you need to look at. Now, for example, Sri Lankan stock market was closed for about 50 days, 52 days, if I'm not mistaken. Then that is also a huge risk. If you're a foreign investor, you want to exit a market You see the share price coming down, you want to exit, you want to sell quickly. And the market is closed, there is absolutely nothing you can do, right? How can you exit? So liquidity becomes a key concern. It is almost like sovereign risk. You can't take your investment out. You can't take the dollars out. It's like sovereign risk. Shalini, your question is options. Which options do you mean? Your question is, please explain options. Okay, what options do you mean? Because you have share options, derivative options, call options, put options, so many options. Okay, derivative desk, right. Right, Shalini, not to worry. We will get into options and we will deep dive into options. Not very deep, but we will be covering options, right? So don't panic. It will be covered. Let's not do it now itself. Right? But it's one of the most interesting instruments that you will come across, options. But if I may give a clue, options, I would say, are used day to day by most of you. Right? All of you are using options on a daily basis, almost. Yeah. Think about it. About a couple of months down the line, we will come across options. Then we will take this up again. Right. Okay. So the question is, company A has the following details. The authorized share capital is 10,000. So that means they can issue 10,000 shares. And they have issued 1,000 shares. Out of 10,000 maximum possible issue, they have issued only 1,000. Par value of share is 10 rupees. Right? Mr. Sam has purchased 100 shares. So what is Sam's ownership? So Sam has purchased 100 shares. How can you decide his ownership? Is it as a percentage of authorized shares or issued shares? Yeah, ownership is calculated as a percentage of issued share capital. Okay, so issued shares is 1,000. Sam has purchased 100. So he owns 10%. That's how ownership is calculated. Question number 2. X Limited has 250,000 authorized shares. So they can issue a maximum of 250,000 authorized shares. It is issued shares is 100,000, nominal value 10 at a share price of 15, right? So nominal price is 10, share price is 15. You are required to state the share capital and share premium collected. So 10 rupees is the nominal value into 100,000 shares. 1 million will be the share capital. Share premium is, see, the share is trading at a premium of 5 into 100,000, 500,000. Okay, so share capital is 1 million, share premium 500,000. Okay, so any questions up to now? No questions, let's move on. The current practice is there is no nominal value is considered. And you do not account for the premium. So the share capital is issued price into number of shares. So in the previous example, the share is issued at 15 rupees, number of shares 100,000. So the share capital is 1.5 million. Question number 2, X Limited issues 100,000 shares at 15 each. You are required to state the share capital of the company. So it's 100,000 into 15, 1.5 million rupees. Share capital versus equity. Equity means the owner's interest in the organization, right? Equity means what is the owner's interest or the ownership in an organization. Share capital is part of equity. right? So equity is your total assets minus total liabilities. Total assets minus liabilities gives you the equity amount. So the types of shares, you can have voting shares, non-voting shares, right? In ordinary shares, you can have voting and non-voting. Now, shares, you can have ordinary shares or preference shares, right? Ordinary shares have voting rights. Remember, preference shares do not have voting rights. Now, in the case of a liquidation, if a company is being liquidated, the difference is ordinary shareholders will be paid after preference shareholders. So the liquidation order, the priority will be given for preference shareholders. Ordinary shareholders will get less priority. That is one thing. The other thing is when it comes to paying dividends, you cannot pay ordinary shareholders dividends if you are not paying preference shareholders dividends, right? That is one difference. So remember, preference shares have no voting rights, ordinary shares have voting rights, right? And priority is always given to preference shares. That's why they are called preference shares. Ordinary shares can be voting or non-voting. And so voting, as it implies, gives you the voting right, whereas non-voting does not have voting rights. Preference shares on the basis of accumulating dividends can be either cumulative preference shares or non-cumulative preference shares. Now, cumulative and non-cumulative means if a company declares dividends to preference share to shareholders, it has to declare dividends to preference shareholders first. No? So if it is a cumulative preference share, right? That means if, let's say, dividends of 1 rupee per share is declared this year, and it is, let's say there is preference share issued, and in the agreement it says 1 rupee dividends per share, but a company has no obligation to declare dividends every year. Now, in the case of cumulative preference shares, the difference is if a company does not pay dividends in a particular year, let's say they did not pay dividends in 2019, and if it's cumulative, then the company has an obligation to pay last year's preference share dividends plus this year's preference share dividends this year, right? So you cannot forget about last year. Cumulative means it accumulates, right? So last year's dividends will have to be paid this year. Cumulative preference shares. Non-cumulative preference shares, there is no such thing. If you don't pay last year's dividend, there is no obligation to pay this year's dividend, right? That's non-cumulative. On the basis of redemption, preference shares can be redeemable, irredeemable. Right? Redeemable means there is a maturity date. Irredeemable, there is no maturity date. So preference shares, let's say, will be issued by a company, might be 10-year preference shares. So these preference shares are redeemable in 10 years. They can be redeemed in 10 years. If it's irredeemable, there is no such thing. It remains indefinitely, no maturity date. Ordinary voting shares, they are virtual owners of companies, right? So if you have voting shares, you actually own a company. If you have invested 10% of John Kears, that means you have 10% voting rights in the company. They have voting rights and control the working of the company. There is no fixed rate of dividends. Now, if you are invested in voting shares, ordinary shares, your dividend is not fixed, right? So 1 year it might be 1 rupee of dividends for every share. Next year they might declare 2 rupees dividends. Next year 50 cents dividends. Likewise, there is nothing fixed, unlike in the case of preference shares. Dividend is paid after dividend at a fixed rate is paid to preference shareholders, right? So preference shareholders will be paid different dividends before ordinary shareholders. At the time of liquidation, capital is paid after preference shares have been paid back in full. So when a company is being liquidated, the capital is paid only after preference shareholders get their money. Ordinary shares are not redeemable. There is no maturity date for ordinary shares. Non-voting shares, very easy to remember, voting and non-voting. Non-voting shares have no voting rights, right? So they cannot cast a vote at the AGM. They cannot elect directors to the company. If you follow the Sri Lankan stock market, there are X and N. X is voting, N is non-voting. Sorry, I got it wrong. N is voting, X is non-voting. Right? Yeah, X is voting, N is not. What am I saying? N is voting, X is non-voting. Right? So preference shares are those shares which carry with them preferential rights for their shareholders. They have a fixed rate of dividends. They will always say it's ₹1 per share dividend. Can be either cumulative or non-cumulative. Can be redeemable or irredeemable. They get priority as to payment of dividends, preference as to repayment of capital during liquidation of the company. So when the company is being liquidated, preference shareholders get priority. Generally, preference shareholders do not have voting rights. Preference shares, if you invest in preference shares, you don't have voting rights. So as we discussed, preference shares can either be cumulative or non-cumulative. If dividends keep accumulating, they are cumulative. If they don't accumulate, non-cumulative. Can be redeemable or irredeemable. Redeemable means there is a maturity date, and irredeemable, there is no maturity date. Right. Methods of issuing shares: offer for sale. This is where the company which is issuing shares will offer the shares to an issuing house. Right. Generally, a merchant bank will act as an issuing house. The share bought by the issuing house will be reissued to the general public. So that's how offer for sale will work. So because then a company will approach an issuing house, and all the shares will be sold to the issuing house. And issuing house will go around and find investors on behalf of the company. And so the issuing house will end up selling shares to the public. That's called offer for sale. Initial public offer. This is where the company will direct issue shares to the general public by preparing a document called a prospectus, which will be used to invite the general public to participate in the share issue. So an initial public offer is where the company comes up with shares for the public for the first time, and that is why they have to do what is called a prospectus. So as we discussed at the beginning, the company will get money only at the initial public offer. A private placing is where the company which is carrying out the share issue will select a large institutional investor or investors and offer the shares by conducting roadshows. Roadshow is where the company will conduct a presentation to educate the selected investors about share issue. Okay. So usually roadshows are done by brokers, or it can even be done by a company. Using roadshows, you can do a private placement, right? You can choose investors. You can target certain investors. Now, if you all remember marketing, you would have done direct marketing. Roadshow is something like that. So you can target your investor and go after the guy. And if he's willing to invest, you do a private placement. Right? The shares are not given to the public. It's only with a particular investor. Offer for sale by tender. This is where the company which is issuing shares will call upon the investor to bid the price at which they are willing to buy shares. So it's like a tendering process. So the highest bidder will get the tender. Therefore, each individual investor will indicate the quantity of shares they expect to buy and the price they are willing to pay. The company should decide upon the price at which all the shares can be issued and collect the highest possible revenue. Right? So like in a tender, your objective in this case is to issue all your shares at the highest possible value. Right? So let's say 2 people have applied for shares. Total number of shares to be issued, let's say, is 20. And 2 guys have applied. One has applied for 15 shares at 50 rupees. And the other guy has applied for 5 shares at 100 rupees. First, you will allocate 5 shares at 100. Then you will go back to the other guy and take 15 shares at 50 rupees. Right? So that's how you do offers for sale by tender. You issue all of your shares at the highest possible revenue. Stock and exchange introduction. This is where a company which has already has shares in issue and wants to obtain a listing in a recognized stock exchange. And so that is where you introduce your share into the market. Introduction. The stock exchange introduction, the company will not issue new shares. Right? So remember, it's not new shares being issued. but existing shares being listed in the stock market. In a stock exchange introduction, the company will not issue new shares, but will obtain a facility to have existing shares traded in the stock exchange. Okay. Right. So types of markets. Now there are two ways that you can buy shares: order-driven markets and code-driven markets. Right. Order-driven markets, the difference is you keep an order with your broker. Right now, for example, you might tell him if you want to buy shares, let's say of Dialog. Right. You can tell your broker to buy Dialog at a price of 9. Okay, buy 100 shares of Dialog, 1,000 shares of Dialog at a price of 9. Now that means you want to buy 1,000 shares only at 9. If it's 950, you will not buy. If it is 10, you will not buy. You will only buy at 9. That's called an order-driven market. Order-driven market. Now, the benefit is if a transaction is done, if at all a transaction is done, you know that it will be done at 9, only at 9 rupees. Because the order you have placed 1,000 shares at 9 rupees. But when will you get the shares? You don't know. Because now the price is 10. When will it hit 9? When will it come to 9? You won't know. Will it come to 9 on Monday? Perhaps. Will it come on Tuesday? You never know. Wednesday or next week, next month, next year, no one knows. Right? But if at all it is done, it will only be done at 9, not at any other price. Okay, that's called an order-driven market. So if you are doing an order-driven market, there is price is certain, only at 9. So there is price certainty, execution is uncertain. You don't know when it will be executed or not, or whether it will be executed or not. It's a price certainty, execution uncertain. Then there is another market called code-driven market, order-driven market and code-driven market. Now in a code-driven market, what you do is if you want to buy Dialog, you buy at whatever the market price. So if Dialog is now trading at 10 rupees 40 cents, you will buy at 10 rupees 40 cents. Right? If you want 1,000 shares, if 500 is trading at 10 rupees 40, you buy 500 trading at 10 rupees 40, you buy 500 at 10 rupees 40. Now your requirement is 1,000. The next you might buy another 100 at 10 rupees 50. Maybe another 200 at 10 rupees 60. And the balance 200 you will buy at 10 rupees 70. Likewise. Okay. So you keep hitting every offer in the market. That's called a code-driven market. If you are dealing through a code-driven market, then execution is certain. Execution certain. Price is not certain. You don't know whether you will buy at 1040, 1050, 1060, 1070, etc. Execution is certain. You're guaranteed that you will get your shares. At what price? You don't know. Okay, so that's the difference between order-driven and code-driven markets. Two different markets. Now, if you are an investor and you are in a hurry to buy, you feel a share price will go up. Right? It will go up drastically. Then you should use a code-driven market. But if you feel it's worthwhile buying only at a discount, then you need to go for an order-driven market. Right? So it depends on your view of the market and whether the market is active and whether it's moving a lot. Right? And whether you're in a hurry to buy. So if you're in a hurry, if you're in a real hurry, then you have to go for a code-driven market. But if you can wait and you want to wait until the market comes down, you have to go for order-driven. Right? So if it's urgent, remember you have to go for code-driven. Order-driven markets, order matching and trade pricing rules are used to match the orders of buyers and sellers. Exchanges and automated trading systems are examples of order-driven markets. Code-driven markets, investors trade with dealers that maintain inventories of securities, currencies, or contracts. Share market is a market of shares. It is a market like any other market, such as a grocery store. Share market is an established market where people can freely buy and sell shares issued by companies. A stock exchange or a share exchange is an exchange or an organized marketplace on which shares are bought and sold. Share exchanges operate under strict rules, regulations, and guidelines, like the Colombo Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange. Tokyo Stock Exchange, right? So stock exchanges. So all the shares are listed in a stock exchange. Share indices are share market indices which are very commonly used to measure and track performance of various segments of the market. Example, the All Share Price Index, which is now at around 4,800. Just before COVID, it was closed at the beginning of this year, it was 6,000 plus. It is now down to 4,800, right? So you have lost 26% of value. All share, the ASPI is down by about 26% year on year. A huge drop simply because of COVID. You all would have seen the number of US companies that are expected to file for bankruptcy. Now, JC Penney, it had already filed for bankruptcy even before COVID-19. Right, so that's a retail chain. But the surprise to me was Victoria's Secrets, right, a giant which is likely to file for bankruptcy. Now look at Emirates Airlines; they have shed 30% of jobs. So terrible, isn't it? Now, All Share Price Index. It's a market value based index. So we also have S&P SL20, and that is the 20 most liquid shares are listed under S&P SL20. It used to be Milanka, now it is called S&P SL20. They can track whether the market is moving up or down. So based on where the share index is, you will know whether the market is going up or down. Now, for example, if the All Share today is 4,800, tomorrow it goes to 5,000, then that means the market has gone up. But it doesn't mean that all 297 or 300 shares listed on the All Share Index has gone up. Right? It is dominated by the high market cap securities like market cap in counters like John Keells, Commercial Bank, CTC, and all that. Right? So a small increase in value in the high market cap will increase the index, whereas all the others may have come down and the blue chips have gone up. And that might still drive the market up. So it doesn't mean, just because the index is going up, it doesn't mean that all the shares are going up. It means the entire market overall, or the market total market capitalization is going up. Equity investors generally invest. Investors generally refers to buying and holding of shares of stock on a market by individuals and firms in anticipation of income from dividends and capital gains as the value of stock rises. So if you invest in equity, you will get returns in the form of dividends or capital gains. Now, last week, we saw Sampath Bank declaring 11.75 rupees per share. Also, HNB declared 3.5 rupees per share of dividends. Cash dividends 3.5, scrip dividends 3.5. Right? So 7 rupee dividends per share, split on the basis of 3.5 rupees cash, 3.5 rupees scrip dividends per share. Sampath Bank cash dividend of 11.75. Now, Central Bank has imposed a rule for this year where banks are not supposed to declare dividends. Right? Going forward, banks will not declare dividends. So you will benefit if from dividend income as well as capital gains. Right? So if you buy HNB at 95 and the price goes to 110, that is called capital gain. So the appreciation in price is 15 rupees. If you purchase at 95, it's a return of about 15% on. Right? That's how you gain. Likewise, if the price falls, if it comes down to 85, so that's a 10 rupee drop on a price of 95, about a 12% drop. Okay, so you can have capital gains as well as losses. There is no guarantee that any equity investor will make capital gains. No guarantee at all. Likewise, if you invest in debt instruments, you will get interest, also capital gains, right? How you make capital gains in debt instruments is, now let's say you bought a bond, a 10-year bond at a yield of 10%. So that means you have invested for 10 years at a yield fixed of 10%, right? Whatever happens in the market for the next 10 years, your return is fixed at 10%. So you will benefit if market interest rates, what happens? Goes up or goes down? Market interest rates go down, you will benefit. For 10 years, you have locked in at 10% now. So after you lock in at 10%, if market rates fall to 8%, right? Then your opportunity cost, if you look at the opportunity cost, you could have invested at 8%. Now we have invested already at 10%. So you are gaining the 2%. That is your capital gain. But if market rates go to 15% the next day, and you are stuck with that investment, it gives you 10%. Right? You could have invested at 15%. You missed 5%. So that 5% will reflect your capital loss. So that's how bond markets work. Yeah. Right. So that's equity. I hope it's clear. On fundraising instruments. Right. Global Depository Receipts or GDR. So what's a GDR? Global Depository Receipt. Now, those of you from HNB or John Keats will know that because you all have already issued GDR. HNB and John Keats have issued GDR. A Global Depository Receipt is an instrument. Now, if a company, let's say HNB wants to issue shares, wants to raise funds through capital markets, it will go to the share market, the CSE, and raise shares. Now, what happens if the maximum amount that it can raise has been raised, and it cannot raise any further shares in the Colombo Stock Exchange because the market is saturated, right? Because if HNB wants to raise an unlimited amount of shares, they can't do it from the Sri Lankan stock market. One thing is, not everyone will be buying into HNB, and also the total market cap is also limited in the country. And so they can't expand beyond a certain percentage. Now, if HNB wants to expand further, or if John Keats wants to expand further, they will have to tap other stock markets in the world, right? Other captive funds in the world will have to be tapped. So one way of doing it is through Global Depository Receipts. This is where they get a listing in a foreign stock market. Right now, in the case of HNB and John Keats, they have got themselves listed in the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. Right? So those of you who are at HNB just can go to your offices and check. You all are listed in Luxembourg. So the benefit, if you are listed in Luxembourg, is, or in any foreign stock market, is that you have access to a wider capital base. Right? You can attract more investors. Now, when you are listed overseas, the attraction to the investor is that now put yourselves in the shoes of a foreign investor. Let's say you're a US investor. You will prefer to invest in which market? In a market you know, which is familiar to you, or a market which is unfamiliar to you. If you're given a choice, will you invest in, you're a US investor? Right now, let's say you're Donald Trump. You want to invest in a country like Sri Lanka, or you will prefer to invest in a market which is known to you, maybe Luxembourg. Obviously, you prefer to invest in a market in which you are more comfortable. But if you feel Sri Lankan stock market is going to do well, you'll ideally want to invest in a stock market which is known to you, but in Sri Lankan equities, right? So you will invest in Luxembourg in the shares of John Keells or HNB. The way you can do it is if the company has issued a GDR, Global Depository Receipt, right? So that's how it is done. GDRs, deposit receipts, are certificates that represent an ownership interest in ordinary shares of a company, stock of a company, but that are marketed outside the company's home country to increase its visibility in the world market and to access a great amount of investment capital in other countries. And so these are the objectives: to increase visibility in the world market and to access a great amount of investment capital. So to access a great amount of investment capital. In other countries, depository receipts are structured to resemble typical stocks on the exchange that they trade, so that foreigners can buy an interest in the company without worrying about differences in the currency, accounting practices, or language barriers. Right? So now this is the attraction to foreign investors. They can invest in a currency which they are familiar with, in a market they are familiar with. Accounting treatments, even the language is more familiar. So foreigners can buy an interest in the company without worrying about differences in currency, accounting practices, languages, or concerned about risk in investing in foreign stocks directly. Right? So there is no sovereign risk either. And so these are the highlights. Now, global deposit receipts are derivative of ADR, American deposit receipts. American deposit receipts were the first deposit receipt issued by JP Morgan Chase. Right? So the difference between ADR and GDR is ADR is listed in America. Anything outside the US is called GDR. ADRs allowed companies domiciled outside US to tap the United States capital markets. So if you are listed outside US, you can tap US capital markets through ADR, like what AliExpress did. Okay, they got a listing in the US. ADRs were structured to resemble other stocks on the American exchange with comparable prices per share, shareholders notifications in English, and the use of United States currency for the sale and purchase of ADRs for dividend payments. Global deposit receipt is similar to ADR, but it's a deposit receipt sold outside US, right? So remember, GDR is sold outside US. Outside US and outside the home country of the issuing company. In a totally alien market. Most GDRs are, regardless of the geographic market, denominated in US dollars, although some trade in euros and sterling. The currency is more familiar because a US investor will prefer to invest in US dollars, sterling, euro, maybe not in Sri Lankan rupees. That's the attraction. Most GDRs are, regardless of geographic market, denominated in US dollars. Some may be in euros or sterling. There are more than 900 GDRs listed on the exchange worldwide, with more than 2,100 issuers from 80 countries. Excuse me. Take, for example, John Keells trade on the CSE at 2,000 rupees. Right? Just assuming this is equivalent to $200 if the exchange rate is 100. Right? So if the exchange rate is 100 and John Keells price is 2,000, the share is trading at $20. Right? Now, a US bank purchases 10,000 shares of John Keells and issues them in the US in the ratio of 10:1. So 10,000 shares of John Keells have been purchased, and they're issuing, combining 10 shares to form one GDR, right? So for 10,000 shares, you will get 1,000 GDR. This means that each GDR purchased is worth 10 John Keells shares. It can be used as GDR or ADR. Okay, so they have issued 1,000 GDRs, 1 GDR is 10 shares. So one ADR or GDR will have $200. Right? Each John Keells shares is $10, $20, meaning 10 shares will be worth $200. Once ADRs are priced and sold, the subsequent price is determined by demand and supply factors like in any ordinary shares. So after it's listed in the foreign exchange, foreign stock market, it will be trading as a based on demand and supply. Preference shares, this we covered already, so let's skip. We're a company with dividends that are paid to shareholders before common stock dividends are paid out. Preference share dividends are paid before common stock dividends are paid in the event of a company bankruptcy. Preferred stockholders have the right to be paid company assets first, right? So if a company goes bankrupt, preference shares will get preferential treatment. Preference shares typically pay a fixed dividend, whereas common shares do not. Unlike common shareholders, preference shareholders do not have voting rights, right? So this is what we discussed earlier. Advantages of preference shares: there will not be a loss of control within the company because preference shareholders do not have voting rights. So if you issue preference shares, if you are short of capital and you want to do a share issue, you can issue preference shares because it will not dilute the rights of existing shareholders. They will be happy. It can be raised for a specific time period at the end of which it can be repaid. Now, preference shares can be redeemable, so it can be raised for a specific time period and then redeemed thereafter. Thereafter, the company need not pay preference dividends. The risk of financing will be less when compared to obtaining a loan. Risk of financing will be less when compared to obtaining a loan because the preference dividends will be paid only if distributable profits are available. And again, you can decide not to pay preference dividends, but if it's cumulative, then next year you have to pay. While taking a term loan, security needs to be given to the financial institution in the form of primary security and collateral security. Right, so that your assets need not be encumbered. You can have unencumbered assets if you do preference shares. There are no such requirements, and therefore the company gets the required money, and the assets also remain free of any kind of charge on them. Disadvantage is it can be a costly source of finance. The interest on debt is a tax deductible expense, whereas dividends of preference shares is paid out of divisible profits of the company. Right now, if you look at the P&L of a company, you will have finance cost now. So interest cost is tax deductible, whereas dividends is after tax, so it is not tax deductible, right? So preference shares, that is the downside. Skipping dividends, disregard markets is not good for your image. If you don't pay dividends continuously, it will reflect poorly on you. Commercial paper, what we discussed earlier. Commercial paper, if a corporate wants to issue funds, wants to raise funds for short term through a debt instrument, it's called commercial paper. Right? So short-term notes issued by large, strong companies. Commercial papers trade in the market at rates just about T-bill rates. Remember, commercial papers will always trade at a discount. Commercial papers will trade at a discount to the market, discount to the nominal value. Commercial paper is bought with surplus cash by banks and other companies, then held as marketable securities for liquidity purposes. So commercial papers, remember, are negotiable instruments. Debentures are a corporate debt issued for a period of more than 1 year. Bonds that are not secured by specific property or collateral. Instead, they are backed by the full faith and credit of the issuer, and bondholders have a general claim on assets that are not pledged to other debt. Right? So these can be unsecured. Usually debentures are not always, but usually they are unsecured, redeemable, subordinated or senior, and rated. Can also be listed. Convertible debentures. And convertible debentures is it's a debenture which when it matures, can be converted into shares. A debenture which can be converted into shares at maturity. Right now, for example, let's say John Keells issues debentures, which has, let's say, maturing in 2025, 31st December 2025 maturity, a John Keells debenture. So what they will say is, if now the current share price of John Keells, let's say, is 110, right? What this will say is, on 31st December 2025, right? They will say you can well, what they will say is 2 debentures can be converted into 1 share on 31st December 2025. That's how they will issue convertible debentures. Now on 31st, excuse me. So the debentures were, let's say, excuse me. Let's say the debenture has a face value or a nominal value of 100. Now, what this clause says is, on 31st December 2025, 2 debentures will be redeemed for 1 share, right? So that means a 2:1 conversion. 2 debentures can be converted into 1 share at a price of 200 on 31st December 2025. Right? So 31st December 2025, you have the right to convert 2 of your debentures with a nominal value of 200 into 1 share. And probably today the nominal value of a share is 100 rupees, right? So 2 debentures at maturity will give you 200 now. So that 200 you can convert into shares. Now today the share price is 110, right? So you're not doing the conversion today, you're doing it on 31st December 2025. Now 2025, if the share price is 250, what will you do? Will you convert your 2 debentures into 1 share, or will you let it mature? Will you let the debentures mature? Or the thing is, now if you convert into shares, effectively, if the debenture matures, you will get 200 now. So if you are combining 2 debentures and converting into shares on 31st December 2025, that means effectively you are buying shares at 200, whereas the share price in the market is 250. Then you are better off if you convert into shares, right? But on 31st December 2025, by any chance, if the share price is 100 rupees, you will not do it, right? You will rather let your bond mature and you will collect 200. Whereas if you if you convert it into shares, you will only get 100 rupees worth of shares. Right? So it depends on the share price at maturity. If the share price at maturity is more than the value that is given in the agreement, like 2 debentures to be converted to 1 share, then you will convert. If it's less, you will not convert. So convertible debentures are convertible bonds originally issued and classified as bonds, but have the option to convert into a fixed number of issuers' common shares, and can be thought of as bonds with call options attached. So remember, convertible debentures will have embedded call options. The conversion ratio, which is usually based on the number of shares per 100, is determined at the time of issuance. Conversion ratio is based on the number of shares per 100 is determined at the time of issuance. So when this bond was originally issued, they will say 2 debentures will be converted into 1 share. Convertible debenture are hybrid securities which offer advantages of bonds and equities. So they are like a hybrid vehicle. The best of both worlds. You can have interest until the conversion option comes into play, and after that it becomes equity. If it becomes equity, then you will again benefit. Like ordinary bonds, they offer regular interest income through coupon payments and a degree of downside protection not found in equity. Right? They offer regular coupon interest through interest income through coupon payments and a degree of downside protection not found in equity. Right? That means if the share price is not above the conversion price, the minimum you will get is the face value of the bond. you will not get anything less, right? So you're better off if you're an investor. Similar to equities, they have unlimited upside potential for our capital appreciation in rising equity market. So if market is going up, you will benefit. Convertible debentures. Advantages to the issuer is the issuer will be able to issue convertible debentures at a lower cost than a normal debenture. How it works is to buy a normal debenture. When you buy a normal debenture, the investor will be paying the the investor will be transferring 100 rupees, let's say, to John Keels, and John Keels will be giving the debenture. Right? So every year, if the rate is 10%, John Keels will be paying interest of 10. Now, if this was a convertible debenture, John Keels will also give, the investor will also buy a call option from John Keels. Now, when the investor buys a call option, John Keels should get a premium, right? So let's say the premium is 5 rupees. So John Keels will totally get a total of 105, which is 100 rupees for the debenture plus 5 rupees premium. But the interest cost will be the same. They're still paying 10 rupees on 105. So effectively, the interest cost is coming down. Instead from 10%, it is coming to about 9%. So that's how John Keels will benefit. Attractive financing vehicle for an issuer, as they provide a cheap way to raise permanent capital. The benefit to the seller is convertible bonds is a reduced cash interest payment. Issuer is effectively selling a call option on their common stock to allow for a cheaper cost of funding. Right. So remember, convertible debentures will have call options embedded. Convertibles also offer tax advantages to issuers, as fixed interest payments are tax deductible. So the interest payment is a tax deductible, tax allowable payment. So there is tax advantages also. Cost to the issuer is, if it is converted at some point, then you have dilution of ownership. The cost of having a lower interest expense is a potential dilution of share equity caused by exercising the conversion feature. Leverage buyout. Okay. Leverage buyout. Now you know what leverage is. Well, leverage is borrowing and investing, not just investing. Now, if you, let's say, want to invest in the stock market and you have $1 million, right? What you can do is you can invest your $1 million, and if your return is 10% on $1 million, you earn gains of 100,000. But if you're not interested, or if you're not happy with 100,000 rupee return, what you can do is you can take a loan from the bank. And let's say you take a 10 million loan from the bank or any lender. So this 10 million loan, let's say, is funded at 8%. Right? On 10 million, 8% is 800,000. Now you put this same 10 million, the 10 million in the original stocks that you bought. So 1 million plus 10 million, total invested is 11 million, and your return is 10% again, right? You make 1.1 million capital gains. Remember, you have an interest cost of 800,000, so 1.1 million minus 800,000, 300,000 you're left with. Your investment was 1 million. You have 300,000 net profit, right? Then what you do is you can pay the 10 million that you borrowed from the bank. Now you are left with your 1 million, and you are left with also 300,000. So you have made 300,000 effectively on 1 million, which means your return is 30%. If you had not done that, your return would have been only 10%. So that's the benefit of leverage, right? It can amplify your returns. But by any chance, if you had borrowed at 12% and your return is 10%, then your cost will be 1.2 million. Your return will be 1.1 million. You will lose 100,000. You're 100,000 in the red. So you are losing 100,000 on an investment of, if you pay the loan, your investment is 1 million, you are lost 100,000. So you get a negative return of 10%. So that's leverage. That's what leverage can do to you. If the returns are good, you will make money, you will amplify your profits. But if you make losses, if the return is less than the borrowing cost, you will lose money. If the return is more than the borrowing cost, you will gain a lot of money. The acquisition of another company using significant amount of borrowed money through bonds or loans to meet cost of acquisition. Often the assets of the company being acquired are used as collateral for the loans in addition to assets of the acquiring company. The purpose of leverage buyout is to allow companies to make large acquisitions without having to commit a lot of capital. Now, if you all can remember how SoftLogic purchased Odell, right? It was a 3 billion loan from HNB. So 3 billion was borrowed and invested. That's called leverage buyout. If you borrow and invest, it's called leverage buyout. Then Singer being acquired by Hayleys, that was also 12 billion loan, right? From NSB and HNB, 12 billion. Again, the funding was done through leverage, not using your own money. So that's called leverage buyout. Attractive is if the return is more than the cost. The other thing you can do is securitization. Securitization is a process of pooling together a group of receivables from financial assets and issuing fixed income instruments to investors based on the strength of future streams of cash flows. You can pool receivables, meaning assets. Receivables, you take a bank's balance sheet, right? You have under assets so many types of loans. You might have housing loans, personal loans, credit cards. Then you can have leasing, gold loans, import loans, right? Various categories or asset classes of loans. Now you can pool each of them. You can take the housing loan portfolio, right? So let's say you have a housing loan portfolio, you strip it out, you transfer it to what is called a special purpose vehicle. Okay, now this is how it works. In this diagram, it is given. This is the original borrower or the bank. Let's say it's a bank. So what they will do is they will transfer the asset to the special purpose vehicle. Right? The asset will be transferred to the special purpose vehicle, and the originator is the bank. They will transfer the asset to the special purpose vehicle, who will administer the asset on behalf of the bank. Right? So the original borrowers, now the people who have taken housing loans, will be servicing debt to the special purpose vehicle, and using the proceeds, the special purpose vehicle will be transferring will be servicing the debt to investors and passing on part of the remainder to the originator. Right? That's how the securitization works. Now this is the bank. Originator is the bank. The bank will transfer the asset class, let's say housing loans, to a separate legal entity called a special purpose vehicle. Right? So they will have to form a special purpose vehicle or a separate legal entity. Now, regardless of the existence of the bank, the special purpose vehicle will continue to exist. So this asset which is transferred to the bank will remain with the special purpose vehicle, and once that is there in place, all the cash flows that is generated from these assets, from the housing loans in this case, will be used to service debt and principal payments to investors in the commercial paper. So not the commercial paper, the securitization. Right? And whatever that remains will be transferred to the originator or the bank. Now, where do the special purpose vehicle get cash? From original borrowers, in this case, housing loans. Okay, so that's how securitization works. So these are the eligible cash flows: lease, hire purchase, building, and the rents, housing loans, personal loans. You can have contractual as well as non-contractual cash flows. Non-contractuals means the amount that you get each year is different, like credit cards, school fees, utility payments, toll collections. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantages is it creates additional liquidity which can be used for lending purposes. Right? So if you're a bank and you are short of funds, you can do securitization to raise further funds. Disadvantage is it will cost you some time and money. Administrative fees, you have to form a special purpose vehicle, which is a separate legal entity. It is a process to do it. Right? So you have to incur significant costs as well as time. A lot of effort has to be taken. Parties to a securitization, you need to not know. Right? You can have a trustee, structuring agent, lawyers, auditors, typical parties. So trust certificates are something similar. You can in fact skip these. Something similar to a securitization. All right. You can skip trust certificates, not required. You can do credit enhancements, right, which is now let's say a securitization has a rating of BBB. So if you want to get it up to AAA, not AAA, maybe A minus, you can do certain things like over collateralization. That means you can keep more security than what is required. Right? You have excess securities that are required so that you keep it, you improve the credit quality. The benefit of improving credit quality is the cost of borrowing will reduce. Right? Selection of quality portfolios now. Instead of, let's say, pawning, you can use housing loans so that the cash flows are a lot more secured. Cash flow matching. You can have power of attorneys. So how you minimize the risk to the investor? If the issuing company pays and the lessees are paying, there is no risk to the investor. If the issuing company pays and the lessee is not paying, then you replace the security. If the issuing company is not paying and the lessee is paying, you have power of attorney, because the trustee will execute the power of attorney to retrieve the payments. If both are not paying, you do the mortgage, right? You sell off the house or the property. For securitization, these are some of the things that documentation that is required. Information memorandum, rating reports, right? In the information memorandum, you can have information on directors, shareholders, financial stability, repayment capacity, industry analysis, internal systems checking, feasibility, quality of loans, non-performing analysis, provisioning policy of the documents of the company. Okay, right. So that's how you raise funds. I hope it was clear. Type of funds. Type of funds. Now, if you have surplus funds, you can invest in, like what we discussed earlier, fixed income or debt instruments as well as equity. Now, an alternative source, if you want, let's say, to invest for the short term, and fixed income and equity investments are not giving enough returns, or you need to diversify, you need to use a different tool. You can use maybe mutual funds or hedge funds, alternative investments. Then you can also invest in real estate and all that. But these are two different funds, right? Mutual funds and hedge funds. You can invest in funds. Now, if you all in Sri Lankan context, you all would have heard of unit trust, right? So these are like unit trust. Mutual funds. It is a trust that pools the savings of a number of investors who share a common financial goal. So what they will do is they will pool funds from a number of investors who have a common goal. And so your goal is common. one objective. All the investors have a common goal. And well, the common goal might be, now let's say there are 10 investors, right? Each of you are investors, and let's say I am the fund manager. Now, I look at your goals. If I feel that they are similar, right? Some of you might want to have a return of 10%, return of 5%. We all are all young, so you might have long-term horizons, right? Maybe 5 years to 10-year horizons, and you want returns of about 5 to 10%, right? So something in common. So what I'll do is I'll form what is in this case a mutual fund or a unit trust. Right? That's how this works. Professional fund managers then invest these funds in a way that helps investors achieve their goals. A mutual fund is managed by a company or an asset management company, which is called an asset management company. The portfolio of mutual fund is invested by the portfolio manager, whose responsibility is to be invested and satisfy the desire of investors. Right? It's like satisfying the wife. Very important. You have to satisfy your customers. In this case, the investors. Every day, the fund manager or portfolio manager counts up the value of all funds holdings and figures out how many shares have been purchased by the shareholder, right? So if you all are the investors and I am the fund manager, I will invest in various assets. So every day, my job is to calculate how much is each of those assets worth. And I will divide by the number of shares that I have issued to you all, or the units. Then I get net asset value. Every day, the fund manager or the portfolio manager counts up the value of the fund's holdings and figures out how many shares have been purchased by shareholders, and then calculates the net asset value of the mutual fund, or the price of a single share of the fund on that day. And so you will have investors who give the money is pooled with the fund manager. They invest in securities, and securities generate a return. The return part of it is given back to the investor. Right? In fact, all of it is given to the investor. The fund manager is not supposed to take anything. How the fund manager makes money is he doesn't make money out of the returns that the investors make. Right? If the investments give an overall return of 10%, what he does is he will charge management fees, right? Maybe 1%, then administration fees or trustee custodian fees. So likewise, there will be deductions coming in. So 1% management fee means the return will be 9%. Minus custodian fees 0.25%, 8.75%. Okay, so return generated by mutual funds is net of all fees. Net asset value is the fund's net asset value fluctuates along with the value of its underlying investments. The formula to calculate net asset value: market value of all securities held by the fund plus cash and cash equivalent minus liabilities. Net assets, no, that means all assets minus liabilities divided by the number of shares, right? So it's net assets divided by number of shares, net asset value per share. Example, let's assume that at the close of trading yesterday, a particular mutual fund held 10.5 million worth of securities, 2 million cash, 500,000 liabilities. If the fund had 1 million shares outstanding, yesterday's net asset value will be 10.5. So net assets, total assets will be 10.5 plus 2 million cash. Yeah. Liabilities of 500,000. So 12.5 minus 500,000. They'll end up with 12 million net assets. 1 million shares divided by 1 million, $12 per share. Right. So that's the net asset value per share. Types of mutual funds. There are two types of mutual funds: open-ended and closed-ended mutual funds. Mutual fund can generate profits from two different sources: dividends and capital gains. So it's like investing in shares. Open-ended funds. Open-ended mutual fund is a company aggregates money from many investors and invests in money in stocks, bonds, short-term money market instruments, or other securities. So remember, open-ended mutual funds will have no maturity date, unlimited capitalization. You will deal directly with the fund manager. Right. right? And the share value is based on net asset value per share. Investors purchase funds directly from the fund itself at a price that is determined by the fund manager's net asset value plus any shareholder fees that the fund imposes at purchase. Mutual fund shares are redeemable. When the shareholder of the mutual fund wants to sell those shares, he or she sells them back to the fund. And so you do all transactions with the fund. Mutual fund is a trust that pools the savings of a number of investors who share common financial goal. Professional fund managers then invest these funds in a way that helps investors achieve their goal. A mutual fund is managed by a company or asset management company. The portfolio of mutual funds is managed by a portfolio manager whose responsibility, this is what we covered already. So open-ended mutual funds. Mutual funds are redeemable. When the shareholder of the mutual fund wants to sell their shares, he or she sells them back to the fund. Then open-ended funds cannot be bought or sold on a secondary market. There is no secondary market. You deal directly with the fund itself. There is unlimited capitalization. No predetermined date of redemption. There is no maturity date. You can exit or enter whenever you want. Sale or purchase of units at current net asset value. No restrictions to enter or exit. Majority of mutual funds are open-ended. Closed-ended mutual funds. Now, this is where a mutual fund is listed on an exchange. So you deal with the exchange, not with the fund manager. Right? So it's like shares being listed on an exchange. After it's listed, you don't deal with the company, you deal with the exchange. Capitalization is limited, right? And price is based on demand and supply, not on asset value. It is an investment company that sells a fixed number of shares at one time, initial public offer. Shares do not continuously offer for sale. Shares are not continuously offered for sale. After the public offering, the shares typically can be bought or sold only on a formal exchange. Once closed-end funds begin to trade, their prices are determined by demand and supply and not by net asset value. Remember, not by net asset value, demand and supply. Market price may be greater or less than the net asset value. Closed-end funds is not required to buy shares back from investors upon request. Right? So if you're running a closed-end funds, you don't have to buy back shares. Hedge funds. Private and unregistered investment pools that employ sophisticated. So mutual funds and hedge funds. Remember, hedge funds are open to financially sophisticated, high net worth individuals. Private and unregistered investment pool that employed sophisticated hedging and arbitrage techniques to trade in corporate equity markets. Hedge funds have traditionally been limited to sophisticated, wealthy investors. Very important point. Hedge funds are limited to sophisticated, financially sophisticated, wealthy investors. Hedge funds may or may not use leverage, make bets on global basis, or look at the technical aspects of security in an attempt to find mispricing in the marketplace. Hedge funds differ significantly from mutual funds because they generally only accept financially sophisticated, high net worth investors. Some funds are limited to no more than 100 investors. Right? So not everyone has access to hedge funds. Hedge funds engage in leverage and other sophisticated investment techniques to a much greater extent than mutual funds. And so their techniques are a lot more different to mutual fund techniques. Fee structure of a hedge fund: the manager usually gets a base management fee on the value of net assets in the fund, such as 1% of the fund's asset. Managers also receive an incentive fee based on their performance that typically ranges from 15 to 30%. So if they outperform the market by, let's say, 5%, out of the 5%, they will get 15 to 30%, the fund manager. Types of hedges. You can have direct hedge as well as a cross hedge. So direct hedge is where you cover your exposure with instruments that are readily available. This is accomplished by hedging one asset, such as common stock, with another asset that shares similar price movements and trades in similar fashion. An example of this would be hedging common stock with call options. Cross hedge, well, Lakmini, that's one aspect. Sorry, Shalini. Call option, right? We'll come across call options later on. Cross hedge involves hedging with instruments with an unlike instrument. Buying preferred shares to hedge treasury futures, right? So you use a proxy. Classification of hedge funds. Now these are the classifications. Earlier we did types of hedges. These are the classifications of hedge funds. Convertible arbitrage. Now remember, we did convertible debentures. When you do convertible debentures, there might be arbitrage opportunities. That's called convertible arbitrage, exploiting mispricing or anomalies in price of convertible securities such as convertible bonds, preferred stocks, or warrants. Distressed securities, right? Securities that are on the verge of bankruptcy. Fundamentally different investments than conventional debt and equity investments. Distressed securities are generally illiquid, making it difficult to impossible to short the securities. The resulting securities may be undervalued and offer superior returns. These funds are generally long, not hedged portfolios. And emerging markets, markets like in Sri Lanka, development markets, generally only permit long positions. Long means you have to buy only, you can't sell without owning. And often there are no derivatives to hedge investments. Then equity market neutral, you need to remember some of the types of hedge funds. Combining long and short positions in under and overvalued securities to eliminate systemic risk while capitalizing on mispricing. And it's called equity market neutral. You buy and sell at various quantities to eliminate systematic risk. Hedge equity strategies take long and short positions in under and overvalued securities to exploit mispricing. Unlike market neutral funds, they do not seek to remove systemic risk. They might be net long, net short, or hedged based on managers' view of markets. Fixed income arbitrage involves taking long and short positions in fixed income instruments based on expected changes in yield curve and credit spreads. So global macro, take positions in major financial and non-financial markets through various means, derivatives and currencies. The distinguishing feature is that they tend to focus on the entire group or area of investment instead of individual securities or classes of securities. Merge arbitrage or deal arbitrage. Two companies are going to merge, then there might be arbitrage, focus on returns from mergers, spin-off, takeovers, and so on. For example, if a company X announces it will acquire company Y, the manager might buy shares in Y and short X. Fund of funds. Describe a hedge fund that invests in many hedge funds. So it's a one hedge fund that invests in other hedge funds. This idea is to get diversification among hedge funds, managers of style. There is fee paid to the managers of fund of funds as well as to managers of the funds in the fund of funds. Then pension funds. Now, pension funds are funds that will keep paying periodic payments to the beneficiaries until they die, from retirement until death. The fund is established by an employer to facilitate and organize the investment of employees' retirement funds contributed by the employer and employees. The pension fund is a common asset pool meant to generate stable growth over long term. So remember, it is long-term fund, not short-term, but time horizon is long-term, and provides pension for employees when they reach the end of their working years and commence retirement. Pension funds are commonly run by some sort of financial intermediary for the company and its employees, although some larger corporations operate their pension funds in-house. They control large amounts of assets of capital and represent largest institutional investors in many countries. Like in Sri Lanka, largest investor is the pension fund. Defined contribution pension plan is where every month a fixed contribution is made to the fund. A retirement plan in which a certain amount of percentage of money is set aside each year by a company for the benefit of employees. So each year, the company sets aside a defined contribution. There are restrictions as to when and how you can withdraw these funds. There is no way how much the plan will ultimately give the employee upon retiring. Now, when you have a defined contribution, like what your EPF is, ETF and all that, EPF and ETF, right? Every month the contribution is defined. At the end, you don't know how much you're getting. So the risk is with you, the beneficiary. The amount of contribution is fixed, but the benefit is not. Then defined benefit is the other way around. At the time of retirement, you know how much you're getting until you die. Now, in that case, the risk is with the employer, not the employee. An employee-sponsored retirement plan where employees' benefit are sorted out based on formula using factors such as salary history and duration of employment. Investment risk and portfolio management are entirely under the control of the company. There are also restrictions on when and how you can withdraw these funds without penalties. Employers will need to dip into the company's earnings in the event that the returns from investments devoted to funding these employees' retirement results in a funding shortfall. Now, sovereign wealth fund is a fund that is created by a nation, a country, for the benefit of future generations, right? A company that has huge surpluses. So it is not a fund that you and I will see during our lifetime. Because to have a sovereign wealth fund, a country should have surpluses. Now, Sri Lanka has had budget deficits from independence up to now, so we will never see a sovereign wealth fund, right? So sovereign wealth fund invests on behalf of the future generation, whereas a country that is running a deficit, budget deficit, will be borrowing from future generations. Sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned pool of money that is invested in various assets. The money typically comes from a nation's budget surplus. Now, Norges, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, is from Norway. Money typically comes from a nation's budget surplus. When a nation has excess money, it uses sovereign wealth fund as a way to funnel its investments rather than simply keeping it in the central bank or channel it back to the economy. The primary function of sovereign wealth fund are to stabilize the country's economy through diversification and generate wealth for future generations. So remember this. Okay, country should have budget surplus. Right. So we have exceeded our time. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you. Stay safe. Have a good week.